Hello everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings of God be with you all. So I wanted to try something a little new. I really haven't done this before, but I've been posting about the COVID vaccines on my Facebook page, and I appreciate everybody who interacts with me there and shares their opinions. I've benefited a lot, and I've learned a whole lot. So what I wanted to do was someone suggested doing something more audio visual, just because that's how most people get their information nowadays. I know I do. So this will be like a little presentation on one of the common questions on COVID. It'll mainly focus around mRNA technology and how safe and effective these vaccines are, how we understand vaccine side effects and all that. So it turned out a little longer than I wanted, and the video might seem a little cut up because I did some editing. But I appreciate you if y'all would listen and give me some feedback. See if, because I really love teaching, I really love breaking things down, and if this is an effective way to do it, maybe I'll get better at it and keep doing it. And for those who don't know me, my name's Yaman Abdullah. I'm a physician. I practice as a hospitalist in the Houston area, and my training was in internal medicine. So I'm board certified in internal medicine, and I work as a hospitalist in a community hospital. And I've been taking care of COVID patients since the beginning of this pandemic, and I consider myself well read on the topic. So here's a little bit of insight into my thoughts, and I hope you all enjoy. All right, and before we begin anything, as a Muslim, I have to start anything I do in the name of Allah, in the name of God. So Bismillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We begin in the name of God, and we send peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad and his family, his companions, and those who follow him until the day of judgment. All right, so we're going to deal with this question of the mRNA technology. It's good to start with the perspective of the skeptic, right? Ask the question the way the skeptic asks it, and then go from there. Try to be as concise and thorough as possible. I'm going to try to just keep it moving. I tend to ramble a lot, but we'll try to keep this going and make this as brief as possible. Hopefully we could get this in under 10 to 15 minutes. So the question is, the mRNA technology is new and the vaccines were rushed. So how do we know these vaccines are safe? Right, which is a very legitimate question. So this is going to revolve around mRNA technology and vaccine safety and efficacy. So this is one of the most stark graphs, the most stunning graphs, this and the one after it, as far as answering the question, do the vaccines even work to begin with? And we see that in here, let me put the highlighter feature on. So in communities that are 60% or more vaccinated, right, we see this tremendous drop in infections, hospitalizations, and deaths compared to the unvaccinated or the lower vaccinated. So vaccines work, that is undisputable. This is from, the previous graph was from COVID-19 Act Now. It's a nonprofit organization that tracks the data. And this one is from the Kaiser Family Foundation. Again, this is just stunning, right? Look at the difference here. For the share of overall cases amongst fully vaccinated versus those that were not fully vaccinated. It's just stunning. And that's what we're seeing now. That the pandemic at this stage in August 2021, it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Now amongst the vaccinated, the numbers aren't zero, right? Because these vaccines don't protect 100%. Nobody ever claimed, there was no legitimate claim that they protect 100% against any sort of infection. But again, the difference is stunning. So just a very brief overview of just basic biology. As far as DNA, mRNA, protein, how that works. This is the sequence of events from how we get to the DNA, which is the genetic code, to protein, which is the final product. So DNA, the best way I like to think of it is the DNA that's in our cells, inside the nucleus of our cells. It's like a book with millions of pages. That's what it is. It's got the code, the blueprint for every building block of our body. In all our vital organs. The only way our body is able to function goes back to this blueprint. So the DNA has this code. It's like a book with millions of pages in it, And the only way to get from a page in that book is to transcribe or to write down the code from a page in that book, and that separate, and you write it down on a separate piece of paper, and that would be the mRNA, the messenger RNA, that goes from the nucleus to the cytoplasm into the factories of the cell to manufacture the proteins. So you go from the genetic code in the DNA, you transcribe part of that code because you want to synthesize a single protein, and you go to the factory of the cell and you produce the protein. That's exactly what it is. So when it comes to the vaccine, a messenger RNA vaccine, the messenger RNA is that blueprint to make a specific protein. In this case, it makes the COVID spike protein, the viral spike protein, which is a protein that sits on the surface of the virus. So, because there's only one of two ways that your body can get exposed, that your immune system can get primed and get exposed to this virus and produce immunity. Either the virus infects you and it hijacks your cellular machinery on its own, it hijacks it to replicate itself and clone itself millions and millions of times. So the virus can use your own cells to clone itself millions and millions of times, and that's how a virus basically infects a person. And that's how it overwhelms your immune system and overwhelms your body, because a single infected person can produce up to 1 billion copies of a virus. So that's how a virus overwhelms your system, and that's how it transmits itself and becomes contagious. So either you get exposed through it that way, or you do a little cheat code. And this cheat code is with the vaccine. Basically, the vaccine already has that blueprint for the spike protein. Instead of being exposed to a virus that's going to propagate itself and replicate itself in an uncontrolled way throughout your body. Or you use a little cheat code to get the blueprint for that spike protein and expose your immune system to the spike protein, where the genetic material is used, and your own cells make the spike protein and expose your immune system in a very controlled manner, not an uncontrolled manner like a natural infection. So, a lot of people think, oh, this is just brand new technology and we're just being experimented on, right? So this is basically debunking that. So this is an article from 1990 that shows that there were studies being done where they were injecting genetic material like DNA or RNA to make a specific protein. They were injecting it into mice, and they found that the cells of the mice were able to synthesize that protein on their own. So the technology worked, but the problem was that injecting raw genetic material is very immunogenic, meaning it triggers a severe immune response. So it produces this violent immune reaction because the genetic material is where it shouldn't be. It's in the bloodstream, right? And the immune system it's going to panic when it sees genetic material, which is supposed to be inside of the cell, like we said before, where the DNA is in the nucleus. The RNA goes from the nucleus to the cytoplasm to take the blueprint to the factories to make the protein. But that's all happening inside the boundaries of a cell. But now with genetic material being in the bloodstream, the immune system is going to see that it's going to panic, and it's going to cause this violent reaction. So then they said, well, we know this technology works, but we need a way to deliver it safely. We need a way to deliver this genetic material into the cell safely. So one way they did it was by tweaking the ends of it. This was a study done in 2013. So they would tweak the ends of the genetic material without compromising the core blueprint, kind of like folding the edges of a paper or shaving off the edges without compromising the core message. But really the breakthrough came in 2016 with lipid nanoparticles. And this is a really important part you need to know about the breakthrough in vaccine technology. Lipid nanoparticles was a way to basically coat the genetic material in this cholesterol-rich bubble, which the membrane of your cell, it's made up of cholesterol-rich layers, lipids, right? So they said, we can coat the genetic material in a lipid-rich encasing or a bubble, that way it avoids the immune system initially until it gets to the cell, and that lipid bubble, like we see here, LNP is lipid nanoparticle, that lipid bubble with the genetic material inside of it it can fuse with the membrane of the cell and go into the membrane, go into the cell, and then you get this is an endosome, and then you get endosomal escape, where then the genetic material can be released into the factory of the cell. So the cellular machinery, the factory of the cell, can take that genetic material, can take that blueprint, and just make the protein on its own. And that's why it's called an endogenous antigen, because your own cell makes the antigen, or the antigen stands for antibody generating molecule, right? Antigen, antibody generating. So this is the protein that we're going to produce antibodies against, we're going to produce immunity against, versus exogenous, which would be, the virus itself, just coming in with its own material going into the cell. So this was a huge breakthrough. And that's why there's a lot of excitement in 2018, right? mRNA vaccines, a new era in vaccinology. And there were even clinical trials done using this technology against the HIV, against the Zika virus. And it's also being developed in therapies for cancers, immunotherapy for cancer. This is a whole new frontier in cancer therapy, as opposed to the standard, surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. This is going to be a lot more targeted. It's going to be very exciting, and I have a feeling that once breakthroughs start happening in cancer treatments, people are going to be super psyched. And this is the same technology that's being used for this mRNA vaccine that's been in the works for the last 30 years. So that's all been happening in the background, right? It's not like they just invented mRNA vaccines 2 years ago at the start of the pandemic, or a year and a half ago, and now they just want to experiment on everybody. That's why scientific research is so important to happen, to be funded properly, because these, scientists, virologists, the medical establishment, they know that pandemics can happen at any moment. And our societies are increasingly interconnected. We live in a globalized society, so pandemics are even more likely to happen. So that's all been happening in the background, and that lined up with the pandemic. And now through this whole process, everyone's gotten to see how this process works out in the open, right? Because we've already had this process for medications, medical devices, any sort of medical intervention, when it comes to how to establish a safety of these medical interventions, of these medications or medical devices. How do we establish safety? What's the stepwise fashion that we establish the safety profile of these interventions? How do we make sure that these are manufactured according to a quality standard, right? Where's all the quality control happening? This is all, this has all been set in motion. There's already a system in place for this. So everything lined up, and people are just kind of experiencing it in real time. And some people think it's just too good to be true, that this technology happened to line up with this pandemic, and we already had this system of government entities and private entities, of both private and public entities, that can develop it in such a timely manner and monitor it for safety and get it out to people in such a timely manner. It's so good to be true that I feel like some people find it so unbelievable, and that might be fueling some of the conspiracy theory that we see surrounding this. So when it comes to establishing the safety profile of a vaccine or any medical intervention, there has to be multi-phase clinical trials. That's why this vaccine is not an experimental vaccine, because the experiment's been already done. The experiment is done in these multi-phase clinical trials. So in the first phase, they take a small group of healthy people with no medical conditions, and they see, okay, how do they react to this vaccine? Then they start widening the circle a little more. Take, instead of a few dozen, a few hundred. And here you're looking at the short-term side effects. How are their immune systems responding? And as you get reassuring data from each phase, you go to phase 3, which is the most critical phase, and that's when we get thousands, tens of thousands of volunteers. Like in these COVID vaccine trials, there were up to 30,000, 40,000 volunteers that were more representative of the general population, because it would be very irresponsible to just test the vaccine on healthy people and just give it to the general population. No, you need a sample of people that are more representative of the general population, the elderly, people with medical conditions. You need a more representative sample in the clinical trial itself before approving this for public use, right? And that's what we did. And that's how that's how we established that these vaccines are safe and effective, and the benefits outweigh any unseen risks. And we'll get to this later when we talk about vaccine risks. In our experience with vaccines for the last 200 years, right, since the late 1700s, what we know from that experience is that the most serious side effects happen in the first 8 weeks of giving the vaccine. And we'll get into details about that later. But these clinical trials went on for at least 6 months before they were released to the public, right? That's how serious this was taken. And after that, the FDA approves it, and then the vaccines are made in batches, and these are called lots, and each batch has its own lot number, and the manufacturers have to test each lot to make sure they are safe, pure of any contamination, and potent. And that's how the FDA caught the contaminated Johnson & Johnson batches that was in the news in Baltimore. Millions of doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that were found to be contaminated and had to be thrown out. Right? This was done before formal FDA approval. This was done under the EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. Right? Under EUA, they were able to catch this. That's how intricate this whole process is. Right? It's not haphazard and random. It's a very, very detailed system, and I think it works very well, and we're all witnessing that in real time. And then how a vaccine safety continues to be monitored. Once it's released to the public, now we're talking about a public vaccination, mass vaccination on the scales of hundreds of millions of people. That's when we really, really have to be careful. That's when we obviously we weigh the benefit versus risk of a pathogen, of a virus that's killing and maiming people, right? We have an intervention. We've established through multi-phase clinical trials that it's got a great safety profile. But once it's out there, just like any sort of medication or medical device, how do we monitor for adverse effects? How do we monitor for suspicious patterns that we have to pay attention to? I'm sure many of you have heard of VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is basically a passive reporting system. It's a self-reporting system. Anyone can go on there and put anything. And that's why a lot of people who were more on the conspiratorial side were saying, well, there are these reports of people getting the vaccine and dying, right? Well, the problem is you can't establish by a passive report, by a self-report, you can't establish that it was because of the vaccine, right? When you do a mass vaccination, it's not like people are just going to stop dying of all other causes. So just because somebody got the vaccine and died the next day doesn't mean automatically that it had to be because of the vaccine. And that's the thing about VAERS. It's a government entity. It's a government website. It's managed and it's co-managed by both the FDA and the CDC. So this is how they catch things that happen that happen on such a mass scale. That's how these things get investigated. And there were incidences before, for example, of vaccines possibly causing autism. There were cases being filed under VAERS of vaccines potentially the thimerosal or one of these ingredients being associated with autism, and it was through VAERS that the cases were litigated in court, and there were independent medical councils that were established in order to investigate this. These were litigated in court, and it was found that there was no link between these ingredients in vaccines and this potential correlation between vaccines causing autism. Right, so again, these systems were already in place, and we have other systems, VSD, PRISM, CISA. This is a very intricate and detailed system, and a lot of us just didn't know about it before. We're finding out about it in real time, and sometimes again, it's just so unbelievable that some people think this is way too good to be true. But this has been around for decades now. And this is the article on the batches of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that were contaminated and had to be thrown out. And this was done while the vaccines were approved under EUA, under Emergency Use Authorization, and not necessarily a formal FDA approval, because FDA approval takes time. You have to establish that not just that the vaccines are safe, but that they provide long-term immunity, and that just requires time. There's no shortcuts around that. I have a feeling if the FDA just immediately approved it, then the conspiracies would really run wild. Like, why did the FDA just immediately approve it and not wait? So some people just want to. It's impossible to please everybody. Sorry, this is going on 20 minutes. I didn't realize it. All right, so here we have a really good summary of side effects from vaccines. So this summarizes our history with vaccine side effects. And basically, like I said before, the punchline is the most serious side effects that we've had in our over 200 years of experience with vaccines happens in the first 8 weeks of giving the vaccine. And this is a good synopsis from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. This was a feature article. And for example, the oral polio vaccine. So what they noticed was, back when polio was ravaging our society, what they noticed was some recipients of the polio vaccine, which was a weakened form of polio, some people that were getting the vaccine were getting paralyzed as if they had active polio. And this was very serious. I mean, it was still relatively rare, and the vaccines at the time worked wonderfully to prevent further polio cases and saved a lot of lives. But there was this noticeable side effect in some recipients, that they would get paralyzed as if they had polio, and that the weakened strain could do this genetic reversion and revert back to the strong original strain and infect people like they have polio and spread to others like it's a normal polio. And they noticed that happening in the first 1 to 4 weeks, and then it can spread to others, and paralysis would happen in 8 to 9 weeks, just because of how fast it takes the virus to spread. So what happened there was the vaccine science evolved with this, right? And the vaccine evolved and ended up eradicating polio. But this was an issue with the original polio vaccines. Yellow fever vaccine is not given standard, right? If you want to travel to certain parts of the world, you have to take it, but it's not given standard in America. But again, like, there's some very rare but serious side effects, like swelling of the brain or spinal cord, most often in the younger population. And it can happen in up to 3 weeks. Multi-organ failure, right, from the yellow fever vaccine can happen in the first week of receiving it. So again, very serious, right? No one says that these vaccines are 100% risk-free. But one thing we have to understand about these vaccines and in the side effects that we've seen is that the viruses themselves, or the pathogens themselves, have a much higher risk of the same side effects we're worried about with the vaccines. That's what we see here, and that's what we also see in the COVID-19 vaccines. That the pathogen itself, the virus itself, has a much higher risk of the same side effects that we're worried about with the vaccines. Another example is the flu vaccine. In the 1970s, right, we had the swine flu, and there was a vaccine against the swine flu. The problem was there was a noticeable uptick in GBS. GBS is Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's a neurological disease that can cause paralysis. It's a very serious neurological disease. But they noticed that there was a slight uptick in those who received the swine flu vaccine compared to the background rate of GBS, because GBS it manifests in thousands of people, a couple of thousand people a year, as just a regular background rate, right? Even with outside of the flu. But in recipients of the swine flu vaccine, there was a slight uptick, and that's why to this day there are screening questions when you get the flu vaccine. There are screening questions about history of GBS, family history of GBS. But from my understanding, the modern flu vaccine does not have a higher risk of GBS. Right? This was associated with the swine flu. But one important thing to understand is that the flu virus itself causes GBS at a much higher rate than the vaccines, right? At a 17 times higher rate. So the flu virus itself causes GBS. Right? So it's easy to get fixated on just the vaccine causing this, the vaccine causing that. But the pathogens that they're trying to treat against and protect against have a far higher rate of these adverse effects, right? And also in the 2009, the H1N1 pandemic, There was a flu vaccine in Finland against H1N1 that was associated with narcolepsy, another neurological disorder that causes excessive sleepiness and drowsiness. It's a very serious neurological disorder. And this was suspected to be not due to, because the flu was never associated with narcolepsy, but was thought to be due to an ingredient, an adjuvant that was given with the vaccine, and that was stopped. And the MMR vaccine was associated in, and for the flu, again, these side effects happen in the first 8 weeks, within 7 to 8 weeks. And then for the MMR vaccine, it can cause a temporary decrease in platelets, thrombocytopenia. This is well known, but also exceedingly rare, very rare. But it is a notable association, and it happens within the first 6 to 8 weeks of getting the MMR vaccine. Oh my God, this is taking way too long. Okay, and then sorry, let me pause just a second. I apologize, I had to pause for a bit, so I'm not sure exactly where I left off, but continuing on to side effects. So as far as from the COVID vaccines, what was mainly in the headlines in regards to side effects were the DNA, the adenovirus vector DNA vaccines. This was using an adenovirus, which causes the common cold, and using a defective adenovirus, which is unable to go into your body and replicate like a virus usually would. So it would use a defective adenovirus with DNA material in it to code for the spike protein. And basically what they found was in the clinical phase, in the multi-phase clinical trials, they were safe, but the adenovirus vector vaccines are the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccines. So they passed the clinical phase trials just fine, but what they found was when in the post-market surveillance, which is after the after the 3 phases of the clinical trials are done, and then you go into what's called phase 4 or post-market surveillance, where there is a monitoring of side effects when the vaccine is scaled to millions of people. What they found was this rare condition of blood clots happening alongside a low platelet count. This is extremely rare, and out of millions and millions of doses given, the rate was about 1 per million. And that was enough to put a halt to the vaccine. The FDA said we're going to put a pause on this vaccine, no more administering it or distributing it for some time while it's under review. And I think that was the right call, because even though it's so extremely rare and it could have fed into vaccine hesitancy, I think the opposite would have happened, or rather there would have been way more vaccine hesitancy and suspicion if there was no pause whatsoever. So this is an extremely rare condition. 1 per million is the risk. And if we take and this is a good time to talk about perspective on risks, right? So 1 per million, what does that really mean? If you're that 1 out of a million, then that risk, is that really a risk worth taking? And so this is when we talk about risk tolerance, as a society, when it comes to a situation like this where a pandemic is, a pathogen is killing and maiming millions of people, what risk are we willing to tolerate for a medical intervention that could potentially save hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives? What's the risk tolerance we're willing to take for a potentially serious side effect in order to, in the grand scheme of things, save all those lives? And as far as perspective, 1 per million, if we compare to other risks we take every day, like driving a motor vehicle, the risk of a fatal motor vehicle accident is about 120 per million. So there was a common saying that the car ride to taking the vaccine is way more dangerous than taking the vaccine itself, right? And that gives you a perspective on risk. And there is definitely a discussion to be had about, what's our risk tolerance for these interventions in a crazy situation like this. And given that it was still extremely rare, the FDA did put it on pause. They waited until it was reviewed and investigated, and they concluded that this is so extremely rare and the vaccines are otherwise saving so many lives that would be irresponsible to take a vaccine off the market at this time. So, that's how these things work, and I'm glad that the FDA did that. So the punchline of all this is that in over 200 years of experience with vaccines, nearly all serious side effects appear within 8 weeks. And this is probably the most important slide of the whole presentation. If you forgot everything I said, I want you to remember this. There's a very important principle in science, statistics, and medicine. And that principle is correlation does not always equal causation. Just because something correlates with something else doesn't mean it caused it, right? And there are some silly examples here. For example, the sale of ice cream going up can correlate with the murder rate going up. That doesn't mean that ice cream causes murders. Or autism, for example, the diagnosis of autism has been on the increase, and that's been correlating with organic food sales. Right? Does that mean that organic food sales cause autism? Right? Someone can look at these graphs and say that because these things correlate, that one causes the other. But that's a very important rule. This is a very important rule in science and in medicine and how we interpret data, is that just because something correlates with something doesn't mean it causes it. It can sometimes, like lung cancer in smokers, for example. That's how they noticed this trend. It started off with these observational studies, right, where the incidence of lung cancer was correlating with tobacco use. So sometimes correlation can equal causation, but not all the time, and it's not a given. And that's something that we have to take into consideration when interpreting data, especially when it comes to vaccine side effects. And so this was a good comprehensive review of death reports, and this was done from 1997 to 2013. They looked at VAERS, and they looked at what were potentially vaccine-related deaths. And what they noticed in this comprehensive review was that the incidence of deaths in vaccinated patients, whether it was adults or children, it basically correlated with the major causes of death in the general population, and that there wasn't a particular link between vaccines and deaths in these reports. But what happened were sometimes vaccines would coincide with the general incidence of the most common causes of death. And in children, for example, one of the most common causes of death is SIDS, or a sudden infant death syndrome, especially in the first year of life. So there were all these reports about vaccines causing SIDS. Why? Because it correlates with the time, because the vaccine schedule for children coincides with the most common year of life that SIDS happens. So giving vaccines happens to correlate with the time that SIDS is associated with. So if vaccines truly were causing SIDS directly, then what we should see is an uptick in SIDS, an uptrend in SIDS because of childhood vaccines. And that's not what we're seeing. Actually, what we're seeing is the opposite. What we're seeing over the last 40 years is a steady downtrend in SIDS because of education around sleep position for babies, and parents being more aware of SIDS, being more aware of the environment of kids. So we're seeing a steady downtrend of SIDS over the last several decades, and not an uptrend like we would expect if vaccines directly were causing SIDS. And this is, and the final comment on vaccines, sorry, this went on way too long. Maybe I'll try to cut it up or something, but the final comment is that vaccines, in one article put it very nicely, vaccines have become a victim of their own success. Vaccines have become a victim of their own success. So when it comes to childhood vaccines, they were successful in eradicating so many horrible childhood diseases, right? Measles, mumps, rubella, polio. There's so many disabling, lethal diseases, pertussis, meningococcus, so many horrible diseases that were eradicated by vaccines. And because the worst is behind us when it comes to those diseases, then suddenly we become fixated on rare side effects of the vaccines, coincidences of medical events happening around the vaccines. and this sort of mythology has built around vaccines as a result. So, like the article stated, vaccines unfortunately have become a victim of their own success. So I'm going to end this here. Any feedback or criticism, please feel free to share with me. I appreciate you all listening, and maybe we'll continue this with a series, and I hope to cut these to much more digestible, smaller bits. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings of God be with you all. Bye-bye.